This is my best tip for writing dialogue. No matter what genre you're writing in, always remember that in well-written dialogue, all speakers are unreliable narrators. Even if the book is in first person and we have access to the narrator's thoughts. Because in real life, when we are engaged in conversation, we filter our words to match our agenda. Maybe we want to keep the peace, so we don't say what's bothering us about whoever it is that we're speaking to. Or maybe we want to goad them, so we intentionally say sly or hurtful comments in order to deflect away from our own feelings. That deflection part might not show up in our internal narrative. That would be something that the readers would have to glean from the context of the scene on their own. In literature, the most common place to find unreliable narrators is in mystery fiction. So I'm going to show you a few examples of dialogue from published mysteries in order to see how this type of dialogue works, and then also see how you can translate that style of dialogue into whatever genre that you write in. First, a literary mystery. The Guest List by Lucy Foley. In literary fiction, form matters just as much as story. That's what makes it literary fiction. And in this novel, you don't know who the murder victim is until the very, very end of the novel. The author jumps back and forth in time between before the murder and after the murder, without ever letting you know who is dead until the very, very end. So you learn the victim of the mystery almost at the same time that you learn who the killer is. It's a very unique way of telling a mystery. It's a literary mystery. So in the scene that we are going to be looking at, two sisters are talking the day before one of them gets married. And we are inside the head of the bridesmaid. In this chapter, this book is told from many different points of view. But in this chapter, we're in the head of the bridesmaid. The shape of our faces is the same, like mums. You can see we're sisters, or nearly. I wonder if Jules is seeing it too, the similarity between us. Her expression is all odd and pinched looking. "Oh, Olivia," she says, and then I see it happen in the mirror in front of us before I actually feel it. She reaches out and takes my hand in hers. I freeze. It's so unlike Jules. She is not big on physical contact or affection. "Look," she says, "I know we haven't always got along, but I'm proud to have you as my bridesmaid. You do know that, don't you?" "Yes," I say. It comes out as a bit of a croak. Jules gives my hand a squeeze, which for her is like a full-blown hug. "Mum says you broke up with that guy. You know, Olivia, at your age it can feel like the end of the world. But then later, you meet someone who you really click with and you understand the difference. It's like Will and me." "I'm fine," I say. "It's fine." Lie. I do not want to talk about any of this with anyone. Jules least of all. She's the last person who would understand if I told her I can't remember why I ever bothered to put makeup on, or nice underwear, or buy new clothes, or go and get my hair cut. It seems like someone else did all of those things. Suddenly I feel really weird, sort of faint and sick. I sway a bit and Jules catches me, her hands gripping my upper arms. "I'm fine," I say, before she can even ask what's wrong. I bend down and unfasten the over-fancy gray silk shoes that Jules has chosen for me, with their jeweled buckles, which takes ages because my hands have become all clumsy and stupid. Then I reach up and drag the dress over my head so hard that Jules gives a little gasp, like she thinks it might tear. I didn't use her pillow. "Olivia," she says, "what on earth has gotten into you?" "Sorry," I say, but I only mouth the word, no actual sound comes out. "Look," she says, "just for these few days I'd like you to try and make a bit of an effort, okay? This is my wedding, Livy. I've tried so hard to make it perfect. I bought this dress for you. I'd like you to wear it because I want you to be there, as my bridesmaid. That means something to me. It should mean something to you too, doesn't it?" I nod. Yeah, it does. And then, because she seems to be waiting for me to go on, I add, "I'm okay. I don't know what that was before. I'm fine now." Lie. In this conversation, the narrator says almost nothing except platitudes. "I'm fine" and "sorry." But because we're inside of her head, we also have access to her inner thoughts, her real side of the conversation. And we can compare that to what is simply said out loud. We don't have to guess or infer how she's feeling through the words that are spoken, which some dialogue scenes do leave the reader guessing, but we can clearly see the contrast between what is said and what she's thinking. But since this is a multi-POV mystery, she is still an unreliable narrator because any of the characters in this book could be the killer. Or the victim. So what she relays to us in her thoughts is still a warped version of the truth that makes her look better than she actually is. That is the key. That is what all internal thoughts are. In life, and especially in fiction. Even if the narrator is telling you, the reader, something, it's a warped version of the truth. You know, it's the truth that they believe, but might not necessarily be the accepted truth. You know, that's important to keep in mind. Because in this conversation, the reader takes it to be that Jules is self-centered and spoiled, and the narrator is the offended party. But we are only getting that because we are inside the narrator's head. If we were inside the other person's head, we might feel differently. You see? You see how that works? Unreliable narrator. Second example, a fun mystery. Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone by Benjamin Stevenson. Obviously, according to the title, we know for a fact that everyone is an unreliable narrator because they have all killed someone. and they're not all in prison. This novel is a single point of view novel, and we know that even our narrator has killed someone, but we don't get the story of who he has killed or the scenario as to why the killing happened until the very, very end. The novel is split into sections, each section describing a member of the narrator's family and the circumstances surrounding the person that they killed. And the narrator's section is not until the very, very end. It's the very last section of the book. So we go the whole book knowing that the narrator has killed someone, but we don't know who or when or why. I.e., while we're reading, we know we can't trust anyone, even the person who's telling us the story. In the scene we're going to be looking at, the narrator is talking to his ex-sister-in-law about his brother's upcoming release from prison. The narrator is an outcast in his family because he testified against his brother and sent his brother to prison. And that isn't really a spoiler because it happens at the very, very beginning of the book. I can't have any distractions, she whispered. I didn't have the heart to tell her that, under that policy, her fluorescent lipstick would have to go. Michael deserves his family back. This is my last chance to give it to him. I realized there was another reason for her to be on this roof. She was hunting that one bar of reception, hoping a text would slip through. Have you heard from him? I asked. No. Her? Lucy laughed. I think she might have deleted my number. I'm the ex. You? I wasn't expecting to. I guess we're on the same side, she sighed. Are you worried about seeing him? I know he'll be different, but I'm scared about how much. I couldn't sleep last night. I kept dreaming that he wouldn't even know who I was. I keep wondering what'll be left of the old version of him, if there'll be anything at all. I'm scared there might not be. I didn't say my fear was the opposite, that he wouldn't have changed at all. It occurred to me that Lucy had never asked me about the money. She mustn't have known about it. That's a huge amount to keep hidden in a marriage, I thought. She surprised me again by putting out her hand. I took it. A truce. Her hand was shaking so much I'd have had to grab her by the elbow to keep it still. You shouldn't have done that to him, she muttered, before letting go. So low and quiet I almost missed it. I opened my mouth to argue, but she raised a hand. I'm not saying it's your fault. I'm not that narrow-minded, but none of this would have happened if you hadn't made that choice. He might have ended up in jail, but it would have happened a different way. I hate you for that. She wasn't angry, rather. She was calm and sincere, so I knew it was true. I just wanted to say it out loud to your face, just once. I nodded. I'd had a feeling she wanted to say this to me, just once. Like she liked having just one more cigarette, but I understood. I'd been thinking a lot about the same thing the last 24 hours. I didn't blame her. Like the previous example from the mystery novel, in this piece of dialogue, the narrator keeps his real thoughts to himself, but we still have access to them. He doesn't say out loud what he's really thinking, rather he is trying to keep the peace between him and his ex-sister-in-law. So again, we as the reader can see the conversation as a stark contrast between what is said out loud and what remains kept secret in the narrator's head. The difference here is that, unlike the last conversation that we looked at, the person our narrator is talking to here, his ex-sister-in-law, bluntly states all of her real thoughts, knowing they'll probably cause harm to the narrator. In the previous conversation, we could infer what Jules meant when she was talking to her sister, and we might understand that she's probably thinking hurtful thoughts about her sister, but she doesn't come right out and say them, so we don't have physical access to those thoughts. Whereas in this conversation, the ex-sister-in-law says her true thoughts, and it's not melodramatic. It reads how a conversation like this might actually go in real life. This is clearly something that she has practiced over and over again in her head, and now when she finally gets the chance to say it out loud, she says it with almost no emotion. She just needs to get the words out. That lack of drama makes the sting hit the narrator, and by extension us, hard. Next, we will look at other genres of fiction and how they use the unreliable narrator in dialogue to make the dialogue more interesting and realistic. First, a fantasy. The Goose Girl by Shannon Hale. This was one of my favorite books when I was growing up. The author originally wrote it for the adult market, but it was publicized for the teenage market, which makes it an interesting cross between adult and young adult fiction. In this scene, our narrator, princess, is spying on a group of people having a conversation. We don't necessarily know that that means they're telling the truth, but it means we have access to a different version of their truth than they would be willing to show the narrator face to face. This book is not a mystery, it's not structured like a mystery, but it still makes use of the classic mystery-style dialogue so that we never really feel confident that what the characters are saying is true. While there are ladies in this camp, Yulon, you will stay dressed like a gentleman, Talon said. Celia does not mind, do you, lady? Said a guard by Yulin's side. And there was laughter. Let them be, Captain, Annie heard Celia say, though she could not see her. I amend my statement then. He spoke through a clenched jaw. While there is one lady in this camp, you will dress and behave like gentlemen. We are the royal guard of the princess, and we will act as such. Royal guard of the princess, said Tern, laughing. She is not a princess, not here. Kildenry doesn't claim her, and we haven't reached Bayern yet. Talon ignored Tern. As captain of the guard, Yulon, those are my orders, and to disobey them is treason. The pocket of men backing up Yulon shifted uneasily. Yulon looked at Ungolod, who was sitting on a log a few paces away. Nice and easy, lads, Ungolod stood. This was not the way to do things, but I think at last the time has come to tell the truth. Not now, said Celia. Ungolod winked at her. Don't worry, my lady. He looked at Talon and squinted, though Annie was not sure if it was for effect or just habit from the blazing day. We don't want to fight, but some things are going to change. Yes, all hail Princess Celia, said Yulan. Princess Celia, several men shouted and raised their swords above their heads. Hush up, said Ungalad. He spoke with genuine anger. Talon stepped closer to Ungalad. That Annie could see there were only two who had not drawn their swords. Both sides were poised, waiting for action from their leaders. Is that what this is about, mercenary? Talon did not seem aware that he was shaking his head. You're aiming to dispose of a rightful princess and replace her with a fraud? Annie clutched a branch to keep steady. Dispose of a princess, a fraud. They were trying to kill her. Until that moment she had never really believed it. Then we have a few more paragraphs of narration before the dialogue continues. Fraud, said Celia. Royalty is not a right, Captain. The willingness of the people to follow a ruler is what gives her power. Here, in this place, by this people, I have been chosen. These men are tired of being told whom to follow. Now they have a choice, and they use that choice to call me princess. Celia's words seemed seductively convincing. Even Annie, peering through pine boughs, had to stop herself from nodding. But Aiden stepped up to Talon and challenged her. This is a conversation between people that builds to them plotting the princess's death. The death would have probably come about whether or not they were having this conversation, but because they were having this conversation, they decide now is the time to act. And that is what this conversation builds to. And we know that even though we are the observer via the narrator's point of view, because we can feel the tension in the dialogue growing the longer that the characters speak to each other, the longer that we observe them speaking to each other without them knowing that we're here. The confrontation within this dialogue sets off the murder plot to happen right now rather than, at some distant future time. The next portion of this scene is the princess fleeing. We don't get to hear the end of the conversation, but we are still given more than enough to understand that party's intentions. It's a scene of high tension, and so it's structured similarly to a mystery, with reveals taking place in the dialogue, even though this is a fantasy. And we are more likely to take those words as truth because they are not spoken towards the narrator with the agenda of maintaining the narrator's facade of peace, since they don't know that the narrator is listening. Finally, contemporary fiction. Fangirl by Rainbow Rowell. This is a contemporary novel about a young woman's first year in college. It's a dialogue-heavy book that truly brings the characters to life through the things that they say. Almost solely through the things that they say. Kath sighed and got out her phone. She had 2 texts from Abel. She ignored them, then dialed her room, hoping her roommate wasn't asleep. Hello? Reagan answered on the 3rd ring. There was music in the background. It's Kath. Well, hello, Kath. How was your date? It wasn't. Look, I'm just gonna walk home. I'll be fast. I'm already walking. Levi left as soon as he heard the phone ring. You may as well wait for him. He doesn't have to. It'll be a bigger hassle if he can't find you. Okay, Kath said, giving in. Thanks, I guess. Reagan hung up. Kath stood next to a lamppost so he'd see her and tried to look like the huntsman, not the little girl with the basket. Levi showed up long before she expected him to, jogging down the pathway. Even his jogging looked laid back. She started walking toward him, thinking she'd save him at least a few steps. Catherine, he said, stopping when they met and turning to walk with her. In one piece, even. That, she said, isn't even my name. Just Cather, huh? Just Kath. Did you get lost in the library? No. I always get lost in the library, he said. No matter how many times I go. In fact, I think I get lost there more, the more that I go. Like it's getting to know me and revealing new passages. You spend a lot of time in the library? I do, actually. How's it possible when you're always in my room? Where do you think I sleep? He asked. And when she looked at him, he was grinning. In this scene, we had almost no internal narration from our point of view character. But as a reader, it's still pretty easy to figure out that she is reticent and introverted, while Levi is friendly and outgoing, and undeterred by her unenthusiastic response to him. We don't have to be told that in narration. We get to see it coming from just the words that are spoken. So, there you have it. I would imagine that most writers who write engaging, realistic dialogue don't go into it thinking about mysteries or unreliable narrators. They probably have just developed an innate sense of what good dialogue looks like, but the trick to gaining that understanding is to view all people in conversation as unreliable narrators. Even the point of view character. I promise it will make your scenes more interesting.